Hello, everybody, and welcome to the official Shadowverse Evolve English Edition channel. I am one of your English Edition ambassadors, Ignideus, joined by fellow English Edition ambassador, DifferentFight. How are you today?
Hello. It is I, this time joining for the Grand Showdown happening in Singapore. So very excited because there's definitely going to be a very exciting format. It's a brand new set with Verdant Steel, and it's definitely one of the metas that, I've talked about this in previous videos as well, but this was the time last year when this meta was in Japan that I was sharing, the pie charts from a lot of the tournaments where you could see these like equal cuts of all the different classes. Yeah. And so choosing a deck for this tournament is probably the hardest of any of the Evolve metas that English Edition has had so far.
Yeah, very diverse meta game, and with the stakes as high as the Grand Showdown, with the hot stamped cards and the invite to Worlds, you're going to want a little bit of advice from us too, and that's what we're here to help you with. So first of all, I guess the top level advice for the entire meta game, Chris, you were talking about just pick a deck and run with it.
Yeah, so this is something that I experienced because in Japan, I had my area qualifier that I qualified for that was in this meta too. So I was spending quite a bit of time with it as well. And the nature of these decks, pun not intended, is that a lot of them have a lot of micro decisions. So you guys already know this, that's already out, but with the Nateran Great Trees, you are ditching a card and drawing a card every single time. So that means if you're playing a Natura deck, you will have micro decisions to make every single turn, probably between like 1 to sometimes 4 or 5 times a turn, right? And so you have to really put in the hours and practice with the decks that you choose in order to be able to streamline those decisions, because if you can't, you're going to take too long, and it's also going to lead to more misplays. So before we even talk about the decks, my main advice as someone that experienced this format in Japanese is the first couple of weeks of the set, we're still kind of like in that period. You can spend trying out the different decks, looking around at what was winning, looking at tournament archives from Japan and whatnot to see how people were playing these decks. But now that we're getting close to the tournament date, you want to set a deck for yourself and stick with it and just play every single matchup possible and just use that deck and don't look back. Like, I think we're getting close to the time where you really want to look at the decks available in the format and just pick it and run with it, and there like no regrets. You just have to commit to it, and I think you should do it pretty soon.
You got to get those play lines into your muscle memory almost. Otherwise, you're just going to get like over encumbered with decision fatigue with how execution heavy the decks are, basically. So
especially how many rounds there are, right? I mean, what's also good about the timing in this video is that this is good for the people practicing for Grand Showdown. But even if you're not, like if you're living in other regions and you just have like BCSs coming up, because there's a lot of BCSs, this is also the same format, right? So hopefully that this video will be useful not just to the people going to the Grand Showdown, but also to people just engaging in the regular BCS season as well.
Yeah, that's the hope, right? So let's take a look at each of the classes, and like we said, each class basically has a playable deck. But before we get into that, I guess we should touch on what is still carrying over from the previous metagame. So it's basically just Kuon, Runecraft, and Idolmaster Cool, as far as I understand it. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think if we were to get into the details, there are a lot more decks, but the two you want to be really aware of, I would say, going into the tournament is that you should still expect Kuon to be floating around here and there. Even after the restriction, it's still very strong. And also Cool Idolmaster is very fast, and there are more slow decks in this format, but good players with those slow decks will know how to play against the faster decks. But there are a couple that we'll mention throughout this video that I do think Cool Idolmaster is a pretty good pick into if you expect those specific decks to be the most popular ones in your format.
You can basically just rush them down before they get their win condition off, because you'll notice that in this meta, a lot of the win conditions they require a lot of hoops that you have to jump through. So, I mean, I guess that's a good segue into the first class here with Forestcraft. We're talking about Latica Natura Forestcraft here. The main win condition, of course, being the titular Latica herself, the eponymous win con. Just like get a bunch of Natura and Great Trees into your EX area, then play them all out, recover the play points. Then when that 5 played condition is happening, then you can evolve her for a big storm finisher, basically.
Exactly. So a lot of your early game is just focusing around using the Forestcraft Natura cards in order to put the trees into your EX area. And then once you've built up enough of the trees, optimally, you're playing Latica. And then, of course, Latica gets you back a play point every time you play a tree. So you can kind of like essentially play them for 0. But combined with the avatar, which is the 2-drop, that also actually puts the cost of the trees to 0 to begin with. So that means Lidica is refunding you the play points. So you can use those play points for other cards that either do damage or generate resources. You also have Send 'em Packing, which of course is Lidica's own spell that not only buffs her, making her a 7/7 storm, but also basically takes out any enemy follower, dealing damage equal to her attack. So that kind of means that you're able to take out any of your opponent's annoying ward targets, so that Lidica's storm damage can actually go face because that card also costs 0, and that also means that you're getting 1 play point back from playing that from Lidica herself. One thing we also talked about with Igni before this is that, you have to keep in mind, because this meta is going to be full of Natra decks, Viridia Magna will be everywhere, and what some Natra players will do is they will keep a base Viridia Magna just chilling there. They won't actually engage it, and that way they will try to bait out your Send 'em Packing, that if you play it after the combo 5, you're forced to destroy that enemy Viridia Magna, which will proc her last words to play out an engage 4/4 with ward that will then tank Lidica's storm damage. So you have to be careful of the timing of when you play the Send 'em Packing, because you actually want to avoid destroying any unevolved Viridia Magnas on your opponent's field.
And this is what we're talking about, like the ordering, the sequencing, and the execution of how you play the decks matter a lot in this metagame.
Yes.
And like you can easily play around that by just playing the Send 'em Back in first because it's a 0-cost spell. But if you don't have that knowledge and you get flustered on the day of the event, then that's not something you want to be happening, obviously.
Exactly. So there's a lot more parts we can touch on, but we have a lot of decks to run through in this video. So
but I will just say that the deck it does feel like it plays like the digital version. So if you're sort of familiar with Lidica and the digital version, play a bunch of trees, get a big storm follower out. It's pretty similar, and it captures the same feeling. So yeah, if that's your play style, then you should take it a look.
The important thing is that this deck heals a lot.
That's true. Yes. Yeah. I guess we can touch on that real quick. Like you're talking about the Ghastly Treant, the 2/2/3 tree here, looking like it's seen better days, but it puts the natural grade tree into your EX area, and then you can activate it to banish a tree token from your field to heal you 3. So that's pretty strong.
From very early on. It's like some decks, if the Natra player just like heals 3 every turn from turn 2 onwards, they just don't have a win con. Like they've maxed, they don't have that much damage to do even across 2 turns.
Right, the ceiling's out of their reach at that point,
Yeah, it's like you don't even need to like rely on the Lidica as much, because you're going to just win by like just exhausting your opponent, which is also really good because you technically have theoretically 6 Lidicas in your deck, because you have the 3 Lidicas and the Primal Giant that can also bring back Lidica from your cemetery.
Yeah, so stay alive, then get your big win con out with Lidica. Very execution heavy, but the payoff is pretty dang good, so definitely keep your eyes out on that one. But going on into Swordcraft, it's also another Natra deck here. Natra Swordcraft. Tell me a little about this one. It's a little more...
Yeah, I would say Natra Sword will probably be the most popular pick. I think in Japan it was by far either the first or second most common deck brought towards the end of the format. And, English usually picks up from the end of the Japanese format and kind of like evolves over it. And... the thing
nice wording there, I'll say.
I got it. But the strong part about Sword in this format is that Balion is just an insane card. That basically so you'll notice that a lot of the Natra and Machina cards in the set, the in-class cards have different wordings where they put the tokens. So the forest trees all go to the EX. But then the sword trees, when they're generated, usually the card says put it to field or EX. And that placement is very important because you have cool combos you can do with them, right? So Balion, for example, puts a tree to either place, and when you evolve it, it lets you look at top 4 for 2 Natra cards and put them to EX area. And it also allows you to get rid of 2 trees from your field to deal to give +2 to one of your Natra followers. Can also be himself. But the important thing is that when you're removing those 2 trees, that's another 2 selections you have to make of what you ditch and then draw, right? So you don't want to get paralyzed in that decision fatigue. There's going to be a lot to do in this deck, and it's a very, very busy deck because that buff you do can obviously go on the Balion itself, but you also have Mistalina, who's a 4/6 that on Fanfare plays her strike spell basically for free, which normally costs you a play point, but she has Storm, and she lets you engage 2 trees to get +3 attack and +2 defense to your leader, which is not once per turn. So that means you can basically engage 4 trees, and then she becomes a 10/6 that heal your leader 4. But you can also play her with Balion, and then you can engage 2 trees to buff herself, and then Balion will remove those engaged trees to buff Mistalina even more, and also proc the draw effects of those trees too, and also opens up board space. And now if you have more play points, you can play more trees and then keep buffing that Mistalina. So I've definitely dealt some egregious damage off of Mistalina before, just because of how you can loop those effects. And like, but the setup you need to do for that is crazy because there's so many moving parts in this deck, and we've only touched on like 2 of them basically.
Yeah, right. You also have the King's Might that you have to decide like how you want to distribute that. And the Princess Strike, like you said. And when you ditch those trees, then you also have to make the decision of like, what do you want to ditch from your hand? So, from what I understand, you actually played this deck a lot during this meta in Japan, and you've experienced firsthand just how many like 6 to 7 decisions per turn you have to make just setting up the combo every time.
I think if you generally speaking have a busy schedule and you're planning to play this event, I think I personally chose Natura Sword as my tournament deck during the season, and it's like statistically it was the correct pick. But for me as a player, that was on a very busy schedule during this time. So if you are a fellow working adult with a busy schedule, you need to dedicate so much time to this deck. Like I think some people are just better suited to these kind of decks. I am not. So I personally found myself to really struggle with just how demanding this deck is, really.
Yeah, but the thing is, like, it's so demanding. With the ceiling is so high. Like swinging with
so
a 10 attack Mistalina just feels so good. But yeah, it's definitely one where you have to have the time investment available to you.
Like, don't forget as well that if, for example, like you play Balion, right, and you had some Natura followers remaining on your board from previous turns, you can just buff them and go face, right?
Yeah.
So it's like you don't have to necessarily even play for Mistalina. You can just play for this like crazy good early tempo, and then you're doing so much damage face, and then the Tigress just like swings twice and you win the game, right?
Yeah, Swift Tigress also a 3 play point 4/3 that just engages a tree to get Storm, which is kind of absurd. And you just buff that too. So like lots of options, which it's the strength of the deck, but also it demands a lot of the player basically. So
exactly.
keep that in mind. All right, moving on to Runecraft. The new deck is, in fact, Machina Rune, featuring 2 fan-favorite characters from the story mode, Tetra and Baphomet. Tetra is a card that just, like, pings off the board every turn, basically. Is that how that works? And then Baphomet floods your board with guys in the endgame?
Yeah, I think that's the best TLDR you can really do. Like, this deck, unlike the other Machina decks, which are a lot more, like, micromanagey, and it kind of still is micromanagey, but for example, the other Machina decks we'll look at are a lot more like setup based, and you really have to think about how you're pressuring your opponent. This deck is all about how you receive the opponent, right? So it's all about how you answer their the boards they're putting down. You have a lot of damage. You have a lot of like token generation of your repair modes, or of course, you know, the token itself if you want the follower. But usually you're going to go for the repair mode, and the reason for that is Tetra herself. So Tetra herself, when you evolve her, she essentially, you know, she says that all of your EX area Machina cards cost 1 less to play. So this also means followers too. It's not just spells. But up to 4 times per turn, when you would play a Machina card, deals 1 damage to enemy follower. What's important is that if you read this card carefully, it doesn't say during your turn. So that also means that during your opponent's turn, when you would play, let's say, a Machina spell that she has turned into costing 1 less, you're also dealing 1 damage to an enemy follower. So that means that suddenly you're answering monos. You're answering these things that normally other decks can't answer, thanks to things like her own spell. You know, normally it's just it deals 2 damage to an enemy follower as a quick, right? It's literally just an angelic snipe. But when you play a Tetra, for one, it puts itself to the EX area, which it still has that quick effect, so you can use it during your opponent's turn. So your opponent will likely just kind of like misplay because they don't know how to play around the Tetra. It's dealing 4 damage per my turn, right? This is something that I think, in terms of what you're outputting, it's a lot more easy to think about. But how many play points you're leaving up when you're on Tetra is the more difficult part, because you're able to really answer your opponent's stuff much easier. And then Baphomet is just a good win con, right? Top 5, play anything that adds up to 6. That's a Machina. So you can get like a 1-1-2-2 or a 2-2-2 or a 3-3 or a 3-2-1. So, and if you look at the, you know, the typical Machina followers in this deck, they're 1 drops, they're 2 drops, they're 3 drops. So it kind of adds up really well.
Can you actually get just like 1 Technolord off of that technically as well?
Yes, you can also just get 1 Technolord.
That's also a thing you can do. So just so you know. Yeah. I mean, yeah, it makes sense. You have all these quicks, ping off the entire opponent's board, and then play Velvet, make an unanswerable board, and win the game. That's all there is to it, really. It's kind of more simple from the top level, but
much easier to explain.
It still requires a lot of decision making. Yeah, it still requires a lot of thought of like you said, how you want to conserve your quick spells for your opponent's turn. But yeah, it's a little easier to explain, like we said. Speaking of easy to explain, this is my guy with Dragoncraft. We have Valdane discard with the Natura package. So basically, if you remember discard Dragoncraft from times before, dealing damage with Dracomancer's Rights and stuff like that, it's kind of like that, but you have even more sources of burn, basically, because the Valdane can generate the Shadow's Corrosion, which sits in your EX area, dealing damage for every 5 Naturas?
Yeah, for every 5 Natura cards in Cemetery, it deals 1 damage to the enemy leader at the end of every turn.
Right. And then not to mention that with Dracomancer's Rights, dealing damage with every discard, each turn each turn when you discard, I should say. But that's also, great synergy with the Natural and Great Trees in itself, which also just discard whenever you ditch them. So exactly. It's just a deck that just burns, and it's a little bit easier to explain, I would say, as well.
For sure, especially because Valdane, Valdane, is bad.
Valdane.
But Valdane himself is, he searches out the corrosions or plays them from Cemetery if you discarded them. So it's really good because he gives you waste answer boards. The biggest issue with this deck is that it doesn't really do too much early game outside of just generating some trees, and then you pray that you find your Pteranodon to ramp in order to get to the Valdane sooner, and then you're playing down the rights, and then you have the Carrot, who's also a natural card, by the way, that kind of whenever on last words you would go to Cemetery, you can pop a tree from your field or EX and pay 1 to play a Carrot from deck and heal your leader 1. So it has Rush, so you can loop it in the same turn, just to, if you have the play points for it. And it's overall the biggest weakness of this deck is that it definitely doesn't do so well into aggressive matchups, which is why Cool Idolmaster is pretty relevant now. But if you get past turn 5, usually you're okay. Usually if your opponent hasn't won the game by turn 6, then you are basically set to win. There's no way they're going to survive that much burn damage once you have 3 Shadow Corrosions in the EX area and you have 2 of the rights on board. You're just doing 10 damage
each turn. Yeah. I will say also so I guess against the early game strategy, just what's your best option? Just to Carrot and discarding your Pteranodon for early damage, basically. Sorry, your Tyrannosaurus, I mean.
Yeah, it's basically your rights are also going to probably be going to followers more than the face as well, because you just need to stall out. Because once it gets to the late game, you don't everything's going face, right? So early game, you might be using that damage more to answer your opponent's board. So I think if you're planning to pick this deck, I really would practice against the faster decks, especially because also Natura Sword can also turn on a fast mode. That's why Natura Sword is so good, is that it can play late, it can play fast. So you definitely want to play a lot around those more faster decks.
Okay, that makes sense to me. Moving on with Abysscraft, we have maybe the most fan favorite character in the entire Shadowverse IP. It's Mono, who is the win condition of this one, but this one requires a lot of hoops to jump through, as far as I understand.
Yeah, it's speaking of fast decks, right? This is definitely one of them as well. Mono herself costs 2, but I want you to think of her as if she costs 5, because essentially, she costs 1 to evolve, but you can only evolve her if you have 5 Machina followers on your field, including herself. What's good is that she lets you banish 2 Machina cards from your Cemetery to create a Machina token follower on your field
droid
instead.
Yeah.
So that means that she basically comes with 2 bodies. So you just have to have 3 more bodies lined up. So what this deck is going to want to do is turn 1, 2, 3, 4, basically just be playing Machina followers and have 3 of them stick no matter what. Because if 3 of them stick, you've probably won on turn 5. The reason why I say turn 5 is that you're probably thinking, but she only costs 1 to evolve. What do I need 2 extra play points for? Well, when she evolves, you have to pay 2 and also banish an Alpha Drive from your Cemetery to give all of your Machina followers in the field +2/+2 and Rush. And this is a once per turn. She herself has Storm, though. So that means that she will be a 7/6 with Storm. And again, I said you want to have 3 things remaining on board. that means that the 3 Machina followers that were there from the previous turn can attack this turn, which means that the, optimally just the token that you've buffed can swing into your opponent's ward or something, and everything else can go face with a +2/+2 buff.
That's a lot of damage.
She's going face, everything else is going face, and so that's like the optimal play. But obviously, you're thinking, how do I even make a board like that, right? Well, luckily, Nicola is really good because he essentially mills you stuff. So if you mill, for example, your mono, you can use the alpha drive to play her out for 1 play point, which, then speeds up the game plan a little bit, or gives you an extra play point to play a Machina follower from EX, for example. And he also comes with a spell that basically destroys anything on the field as well. And then you have the Ennea, who also plays a 3-cost or lower Machina follower from your deck. So that can play out the Nicola, that can also play out the mono too, but then the mono turn will take a lot more play points. So that's more of like a later play. And, otherwise you're basically trying to win fast. And if you don't, then you're going to be relying on things like Techno Lord or other deck, like cards from other decks like Ginsetsu or Azazel and stuff like that.
Yeah, but it's one of those things where I feel like we were talking about this earlier, but it sort of goes against your instinct somewhat, where like you have to have the 3 on your board. So like even if there's a really, really, really advantaged trade on the board, you're just like, I can't do it. I just have to leave this up.
I do not see it.
Because if I don't have 3 on board, I just can't play my mono. So it's like, what would you say is the weakness of this one then in that sense?
Breaking. Like honestly, it's the worst part is you mulligan and you see that you've just drawn into a bunch of 3 drops and you cannot make a board early.
And you can't go to the 1-2-3 plan, yeah.
If you can't, like you really want the core or you want the gunner for turn 1, and then turn 2 you want like either the Mecha Goblin going second or the Bone Drone, and it's like this is a very curve reliant deck, and so when it draws its curve, it's like unstoppable, especially going like if it has the perfect curve and it's like turn 5 mono, it's very consistent win con. But there's matchups like Tetra that they've dedicated their life to taking out your board.
Yeah. So because they have quick removal as well with Tetra, so it's
it's like a borderline auto lose matchup. Yeah. So I think it's like the ceiling of this deck is so crazy, but there's a lot of decks that are out to get it, and so you have to be aware of it. Sword is also, they have a lot of sources of damage to your opponent's followers, so they will also be trying very hard. Like when you play mono, you have to keep in mind that your goal is to put down stuff and have them stick. Your opponent's goal is no longer what they wanted to do. Their goal is to stop you from doing that and making sure that your mono is as delayed as possible to the point that they've set up their own win con. So it's going to be kind of like a tug of war in that sense too. Yeah,
makes a lot of sense. Again, I would say that they definitely captured the essence of the deck quite well from the digital version. Lots of setup, and if your opponent counters it, you're like, well, but if you get it off, you're just like, okay, I win. Makes sense to me. All right, finally, last and honestly maybe least, is the Havencraft deck.
Being honest today.
Yeah, the Machina Havencraft. I mean, this one is pretty much just a stall deck in a lot of ways.
Yeah, essentially is, yeah. So, you have Repair Mode, which is a neutral token that is most used in this deck. Everything that is Haven and Machina basically puts a Repair Mode into your EX area and then rewards you for having Repair Modes in EX. So Lemonium's the best example. She's a 3-cost 3/2 that puts a Repair Mode to EX, and then you can banish her Repair Mode from EX to reduce her evolution cost by 1 for that turn. And normally her evolution cost is 7.
Which is like absurdly high.
You want to line up 5 Repair Modes, banish them all, and then you will get to evolve her for 2. When she evolves, she's then able to essentially destroy all enemy followers. She's basically a Themis for 5.
Well, on a stick, it's really
on
good.
A stick, which is pretty good. And she doesn't destroy your followers, so your board sticks around. And then she can essentially revive a 2-cost or lower Machina follower from your cemetery for nothing, but it does have a once per turn restriction. So you can revive things like the Machine Falcon that is a storm that basically is a 2/3 or a 3 attack on evolve. So you get that. You also have the 2/3 2-drop with ward that also puts repair modes out as well. So
the Iron Knuckle Nun.
You're usually just reviving the Machine Falcon just to get some stored damage. There's a really cool new generic card, which is the Melkot, that is like a 1/3 on Fanfare to draw a card. But if you have 5 cards in EX, she searches your deck for any card instead, and it's very easy to achieve that in this deck. So
because the Iron Knuckle Nun herself just puts 2 repair modes into your EX area essentially. So it's you can get to 5 pretty fast, I feel like.
Yeah. It's like otherwise you're basically just stalling out. Techno Lord does damage and searches you stuff. The Father basically is also just like a big, pretty good body because he refunds 2 play points, so it's like a 3-cost 4/4 that
draws 2.
That draws 2 while rushing, right? So this looks pretty good. And then you generate a lot of resources and you heal a bunch from stuff like Lapis as well. And you have a bit more storm damage from Ruby Falcon. So it's definitely not as flashy as the other decks. I think other decks are like, here's a win con. Here's what you can do. Boom, big
turn
damage.
6, explode your opponent.
Yeah. This deck is like, we will pop the opponent's board. We are going to generate a lot of tokens. We have pretty good consistency because we can search out a bunch of stuff. And we have good like resource generation. So this is just kind of like, especially against the decks that don't really know how to play around it, you can kind of just like stall out, make them run out of resources, and then just win through big bodies in the late game.
Yeah. I would say that, it is like for people who just want to edge out an advantage, very incremental advantage, but it's like you said, it's definitely less flashy. So
yeah,
I guess now that we've covered all the classes, or at least one deck from each class, to wrap up this video, we'll just give like a final recommendation of like what deck we are gonna pick. So I mean, you played Natura Sword mostly during this meta, but would you not recommend it as much?
If you have a lot of time, I think it is the deck with the highest ceiling. I think it's if you are someone that is really good at micromanaging your plays, and there are definitely some card game players that excel at that. I think that is definitely the best deck. But you're not only fighting against your opponent, you're also fighting against your timer. And you're also fighting against your own deck because you're going to be very much... The cards that you discard in the early turns will come back to bite you in the late turns. And so you have to be very, very aware of that. So sometimes you really just have to be very trained to make those decisions. So I think if you have the time, I do think Sword is probably the best pick even then. But if you don't, I think Mono's really good in that she just does her own thing. And so the rest of your deck will be built around responding to your opponent. So that's where like things like Ginsetsu will come into play. But otherwise, I also am a really big fan of Latika. I think Latika in general is also kind of one of those decks like Mono, and it kind of makes sense because they're usually used together in promotional marketing.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So they're both decks that really just want to do their own thing. And so you don't have to worry about your opponent as much. Whereas Sword really just adapts to situations really well. And so that's really good for responding to your opponent and also doing what you want to do at the same time. And then, so I think if I had to pick just one, I would say either Mono or Latika. I think, especially at the time of this coming out, I think if you're making the selection starting now, those are the decks that you can really put in just some time into and do quite well with. Just keep in mind that people will be trying to play around you a lot.
I was going to say Latika Forest as well. I think it even the ways that people play around it, if you navigate it correctly, you can still come out on top. With Latika, like I said, like just sequencing your send and packing correctly and not falling into that trap. I think if you have less time to prepare, you should probably play Disdain Dragon because it's a little easier to wrap your head around. And as well as, when you're talking about with Sword, you have to make a decision of like what you ditch every time. With Dragon, at least when you ditch, you get a passive benefit of having the Natura in grave for your Shadow's Corrosion. And you also have multiple targets that are good to ditch, like Trail of Light and the Tyrannosaur. So... and you get a passive benefit from the Dracomancer, so it's like a little less punishing in that way. So I would say that if you have less time, maybe take a look at that one. But if you have more time, the more execution heavy decks probably have a higher ceiling, so you can go with those ones as well. So yeah, I mean, I guess other than that, I think that's it for this video. I mean, hopefully this was helpful to everybody who is preparing for the events, whether it's Grand Showdown or the BCS is coming up. Remember, guys, 21st December is the Grand Showdown for Singapore. Both me and Chris will be casting it, so hopefully this video was helpful enough for you that eventually we get to commentate you in the top 8. That would be kind of cool. But other than that, best of luck to everybody who's watching this. Farewell and really hope you get your practice in because this meta it's one of the harder ones. So
it's a very, very difficult meta, that's for sure. So definitely, for sure, it really rewards people that put in the time.
And I mean, other than that, I guess just make sure to like this video and subscribe to the official Shadowverse Evolve English Edition channel for more content like this because, this is not the last Grand Showdown. So if you want to keep abreast of all the content we're doing over on this side, make sure you subscribe. Other than that, peace.
Bye-bye.